Chapter 15. The Waitress. "And I would be honored to make it for you," the luthier replied. Richard pulled out his checkbook and began writing. "No, Mr. Gaspar, for your instrument, you will pay me when it is finished." Richard, more puzzled than ever, slowly put his checkbook away. "Have you had lunch, Mr. Gaspar?" the luthier asked while removing his coat and tie. He hung them up on a large square nail behind the counter. Richard looked at his watch and was surprised that lunchtime had come and gone. He shook his head. "Would you like to join me?" Richard smiled. "Only if you let me by and allow me to apologize for yesterday." "Very well," the luthier agreed. Realizing that there was no other vehicle outside, Richard quickly volunteered. "I'll drive." The only place where lunch could be purchased in Leeds was at the same small group of tables that Richard and the officer had sat at the day before. "Would you like somewhere nicer?" Richard asked, fearing hot dogs and nachos from such an establishment. "This will do. I think the food will impress you, Mr. Gaspar." "That'll be the day," Richard thought, while reluctantly sitting down. While they were waiting, Richard offered, "You may call me Richard if you like. What shall I call you?" "Until I start your violin, please call me Sean. But once I begin carving, please call me Luthier." "Sean, I am truly sorry for my outburst yesterday, and I do apologize." "Done," was all the luthier said in reply. They waited 15 minutes before the waitress finally came from the back of the store, and Richard had been showing signs of impatience for the last 12 of them. The waitress looked tired and wore a forced smile, but finally got their order straight after having to start over 3 times. While on her way back to the kitchen, 2 other people came in and sat down, and she added their orders to her notepad before delivering Richard's and the luthier's to the cook. "Does it normally take this long?" Richard asked, while thinking of the service he received at his favorite coffee shop in New York. "We have time," the luthier replied with a smile. "Where do we go from here?" asked Richard. "The instrument on the roof will be finished in a few days, and I have already called Mr. Haito. After he leaves, I will select the wood for your violin and begin carving." "I've heard of people selecting the wood for their own violins. Do you allow that?" "I do upon occasion, but for your violin, I must select it." The luthier went silent, as if in deep thought. He tilted his head back and looked up. It gave Richard the distinct impression that he was thinking about the wood hanging from his ceiling, as though he were contemplating each and every piece. When the luthier's gaze finally came to rest on the ceiling light, his expression became forlorn. It made Richard think of Michelle. After stepping out of the police car, Michelle looked up at the glass doors at the top of the stairs like it was Judgment Day itself. While watching her movements, Richard thought, "She must have just realized what she's gotten us into." Michelle looked back at Richard and apologized. This is going to change things. And as always, she was right. Richard watched while another officer led Michelle up the stairs and down a long corridor toward the back of the police station. The 2 men standing beside Richard followed his gaze until Michelle was completely out of sight. It was 3 a.m. Richard's eyes were misty and tired, but he was the only one who noticed that Michelle was walking with a limp. Later, while sitting in his jail cell waiting to be bailed out, he wondered how his parents were going to react. When Richard was 13, Elaine and George were simply happy that Richard had apologized and finally found a friend. But as the years went by, both Richard's and Michelle's parents became concerned at the excessive amount of time and attention they were giving each other. The older they became, the more their concerns escalated, especially toward the end of the summer when Michelle and Richard began coming home later each night. Trouble seemed to be licking at their heels. Salty Pete's wasn't the only thing that had happened since the new school year had begun. A boy and girl spending that much time together can only lead to trouble, Elaine explained to George. The conversation was loud enough for Richard to hear it in the next room. George was leaving on a business trip and, as usual, didn't have time to pursue the conversation. "We've never done anything bad," Richard thought. "Why can't everyone leave us alone?" Everyone included a group of boys that had been teasing him at school. They must have talked to some of the other students from Richard's previous school during summer vacation and learned of his old nickname, Girly Boy, from them. They had given it to him when he first met Michelle. Even though Richard was 16 and the other boys were looking at girls differently, they decided to tease him with it anyway, and he hated it. The real trouble was, Richard's parents only heard the negative things people said. No one they talked to ever commented about the good things they did. They found lost children at the stores. They helped clean the library and pulled weeds in front of the retirement center, always making sure that there were flowers in the vase Michelle had made. Richard knew that many people simply enjoyed seeing them walk by each day with cheery smiles on their faces. "But I guess those people don't talk to my parents. Only people like Mrs. Becker." Some of the things that got back to their parents were questionable, and maybe they did things that weren't appropriate sometimes, but most of all, it boiled down to them simply spending too much time together. "After all, they're old enough." Richard could clearly hear Mrs. Becker's voice over the telephone. It was the morning after they had been out at the lake, late the night before. "Where did you go last night, Richard?" his mother asked after hanging up. His father was still out of town on business. Richard thought how it must have looked and nonchalantly replied, "We went swimming." "At 11:45 at night?" Thinking ahead, Richard responded, "It was hot, so we decided to wear our swimming suits under our clothes and walk down to the lake." "Mrs. Becker said Michelle was all over you when you walked past her house." Richard, looking truly innocent, replied, "Michelle hurt her foot on a broken bottle at the lake, and I had to help her home." Elaine knew that Mrs. Becker liked to exaggerate, and a cut foot was a pretty easy thing to verify with Michelle's mother, so she stopped the questioning. Then she began shaking her head. "It just isn't right, Richard. It's one thing to go out swimming on the docks at night with the boys, and it's another alone with a girl." "How?" asked Richard, testing his mother's resolve and trying to end the conversation. His mother became frustrated, and not wanting to pursue the particulars of boys and girls at that moment, she finished the conversation. "It just is, and you know it." Richard knew it. As Michelle and Richard stood on the moonlit shore the night before, separated by the small cluster of trees, he knew it. As they each removed all of their clothing while facing opposite directions, he knew it. Michelle told him that skinny dipping together would be okay if he promised to look the other way until they were in the water. She had told him more than once, A promise between friends is a promise, no matter what. And there was nothing in the world that could make Richard break a promise to Michelle. Richard hesitated before undoing the first button on his shirt. What if someone sees us? No one's going to see us. I've been out here a dozen times, and the only time someone showed up, I could see their headlights from a mile away. Richard could tell that Michelle was already facing the other direction and pulling off her clothes by the sound of her voice. You've done it here before? He asked, surprised. Are you ready? She asked in return. Richard could tell that Michelle was ready and waiting. I guess so, he sheepishly replied while removing the rest of his clothes. Are you ready? Michelle repeated, never willing to accept any half-hearted answer from Richard. Yes, he finally squeaked out. Then let's go. Down they went, toward the water with their backs to each other, walking just a few feet apart. Richard's heart was pounding in his chest. He didn't know if it was because he was afraid of getting caught or because there was a 15-year-old girl with no clothes on standing right behind him, even though she was his best friend. When they finally stepped into the water, Richard commented, This is a lot warmer than I thought. Isn't it wonderful? Michelle replied while pushing away from the shore. Richard followed her example and leaned back. They floated into the middle of the lake, side by side. What if someone sees us now? We'll swim to the other side and run for it, Michelle answered with excitement in her voice. Richard thought of his wallet and pants. Oh, great, he moaned. Then we wouldn't have our clothes, and they'd also know who we were. After a moment, he heard her soft, simple words float across the water. Trust me. Michelle had never used those words before, and he knew that inviting him there was very special to her. Richard was ashamed. He knew they were best friends, no matter what, so he decided to try to relax and forget about getting caught. It is beautiful, Richard commented after looking up at the stars in the night sky. He kicked his feet just enough to keep moving beside Michelle while they floated aimlessly in the middle of the lake. I love the feeling of floating and being able to see forever, she told him in a dreamy voice. Richard thought about Michelle's words. It was a nice feeling, but mostly because she was there. After a few minutes, they began circling the lake. They tried staying a few feet apart, but when they turned, their hands touched. Richard started to draw back, but Michelle gently held on. They went around the lake 3 times, talking about life. Then they floated in silence, holding hands and looking at the stars. Richard was glad he was there. He was glad that Michelle was his friend. We better get back, Michelle commented as they floated toward the grove of trees again. Their hands reluctantly separated, then they paddled back to shore. It was a warm autumn night, and they didn't feel any chill while rising out of the water. Richard thought that it would sure look funny to anyone who could see them there, walking toward the trees back to back. Michelle suddenly screamed in pain. Richard had never heard Michelle raise her voice, and he turned by reflex before he could even think. Michelle stood in the moonlight about 10 feet away, bent over. She was turned sideways, and Richard noticed a dark blotch on the side of her stomach. It took a moment for Richard to realize that he was looking at a large birthmark. He had never seen it before because of the modest swimming suit she always wore. He then looked down as Michelle picked up her injured foot. A large piece of a broken bottle fell to the ground, and she balanced on one leg while pulling out the remaining pieces of glass with trembling fingers. Blood dripped onto the remains of the bottle still embedded in the sand, and she let out a whimper. They looked into each other's eyes while Michelle dropped her foot and stood up. It seemed like an eternity to Richard as tears welled up in her eyes and flowed down her cheeks. Michelle turned, and without saying a word, she painfully started toward the trees again. Richard swung back around and was soon behind the trees, drying off and getting dressed. He didn't know what to do, and he worried about her the entire time. "Are you okay?" he pleaded for an answer. "I don't know," came her tearful reply. "I'm so sorry I made us break our promise." Richard could hear Michelle sobbing on the other side of the branches. He then realized that it was not her injured foot that had made her cry, and he felt worse than he ever thought possible. He couldn't imagine what she must be going through, and it seemed like forever slowly passed by while he waited for her to get dressed. "Okay," a hurt, soft voice came from the other side of the trees. Michelle was sitting down, trying to clean off the dirt and sand from her foot. Her hands were shaking, and she looked up at Richard in pain. Tears filled Richard's eyes as he bent down and gently picked Michelle up. Without a word, he carried her back to the lake so she could wash her foot in the water. The wound was very deep, yet they both knew that it would eventually heal with time. "Here it is," the Luthier announced with a smile. The waitress had finally reappeared and was approaching their table. Richard looked up just in time to see her trip and start falling in his direction. She caught herself before any damage was done, yet Richard jerked back with a disgusted expression, and it remained on his face the entire time she was arranging the plates on the table. "Thank you," pleasantly offered the Luthier as she walked away. Richard only settled down after smelling the steaming hot food. He took a bite and realized that the Luthier was right. He was impressed. With the food, anyway. While they ate, Richard talked about violins, what he liked in particular instruments and what he didn't. He named many of the finest instruments in the world and told the Luthier what he thought of each one. After finishing the meal, Richard asked, with some reserve, "Do you mind if I visit while the violin is being made? Or if I watch you while you work?" "You are welcome to come to the shop as often as you like," replied the Luthier, surprising Richard with his answer. Richard had heard that the old masters guarded their secrets with their lives, and that's why their recipes and processes had been lost. Besides, all the other makers Richard had ever met acted as though they each had their secrets, and the Luthier was the most eccentric of all. After the meal, the waitress came and placed the bill on the table. It was crumpled, some of the words were misspelled, and the total came to $18.23. Richard placed a $20 bill on top and asked the Luthier, "Are you ready?" The Luthier glanced at the receipt and the $20, then pulled out a $20 bill of his own and placed it on top. "I said I was buying," Richard insisted. "Tip," was the Luthier's reply. "Are you kidding?" Richard was thinking of the waitress's less than spectacular performance. "It is impossible to understand what those that serve us go through," replied the Luthier. Without another word, he turned and walked out. Richard stood there for a minute, first looking at the door, then back down at the $40 on the table. He shook his head and reluctantly left both behind. Richard started the engine while the Luthier stared out the front window. As the Blazer pulled back onto Main Street, the Luthier looked ahead as if in a trance. When I was young, I started working in a restaurant, cleaning tables and washing dishes. Not many days went by before I noticed this one young woman who walked to work each day. It didn't matter what the weather was or the shift she worked. She walked. If she worked in the early morning, I watched her kiss her 3 small children dressed in ragged clothes goodbye before they continued on their way to school. Sometimes the uniform she wore looked acceptable. Sometimes it was weathered. She wasn't beautiful and never flirted with the customers like the other waitresses, but she was always pleasant and worked hard, though I could tell that she was usually too tired to do her job well. I watched night after night while the customers complained that she was too slow, or how they ordered her around and talked bad about her. Some even seemed to get pleasure out of making her jump to their every demand, then leave no tip at all. But, I thought, if you average it out, she really didn't deserve much more than she got because of how slow she was and the mistakes she made. One night, I walked back to the employees' table and watched her count her meager tips for the evening. When she was done, she laid her head on the small pile of coins and began weeping. Tears filled the Luthier's eyes. I was a young, hard worker and a blind, stupid fool. I asked her, "What's wrong? I work twice as hard as you do, and I don't get any tips." She looked up at me with eyes red and swollen. "Don't you know?" she cried. "What?" She burst into tears and pointed toward a small sign taped to the wall, which I had never noticed. It looked like it had been hanging there forever and blended into the wallpaper. It was the minimum wage for regular employees and the minimum wage for waitresses. Her wage was less than half of mine and not enough to support anyone. I took everything out of my wallet and emptied my pockets. I placed it all on the table and walked out. I left, knowing that I could never work there again. And to this day, I ask God to forgive my soul for being so blind and heartless. Richard and the Luthier drove the rest of the way in silence. When they arrived at the violin shop, Richard handed the Luthier a piece of hotel stationery with his room number written across the top. Then he drove back down the old dirt road.